and parenting. And we're going to kind of continue on talking about this idea of multiple intelligence and motivation. Um, so again, we've seen this already a few times. We saw in our reading assignment, we had a nice description of all these. I had a couple extra terms here. I think the ones that I added were mechanical and humor. I don't think Howard Gardner had those in. And then I can't remember if Gardner has naturalistic either, but some other folks may have added naturalistic as well. People that just have a connection with nature, agriculturists or gardeners. Some people have naturalistic tendencies or intelligence. I specifically put mechanical in there. I have a feeling Gardner would have his own explanation about where he would put mechanical, but I just thought to put it in there just because I know a lot of people that are just very intelligent from a mechanical standpoint. People that can take apart a car and put it back together again without even really thinking about it too much. And that takes a certain kind of intelligence. It is a form of intelligence. And of course, humor. I think some people are gifted that way as well. So again, Ken Robinson, again, he's actually knighted. It's Sir Ken Robinson. He points out that ADHD, it's not that it doesn't exist, it's just that it's being grossly overdiagnosed. And I think that a lot of people are kind of starting to agree with that as well. And it's this idea of the education system really focusing on logistics and linguistics. Think about the SATs. Those are the standardized tests. That's what it tests. Mathematical ability, some science, technology maybe, and then linguistics. And then all these other areas, for the most part, are considered usually extracurricular, or they're not quite as important as those two areas. And a lot of people that have natural abilities in one of these other areas can be left behind, essentially. And that's exactly what Ken Robinson's message was. You may have seen this cartoon floating around on Facebook or the internet. I thought this was kind of funny. I like the monkey on there. He's certainly excited. So motivation. We all have motivations to do things. Usually our intrinsic motivation, that internal motivation, something that it's motivation that comes from within us. And usually our intrinsic motivation is related to the area that we have a natural ability or a natural intelligence, where it's our way of our way of learning. Gardner really started this as a way of learning methods or learning styles, I guess I should say. So, if you have a natural ability to, going back to mechanical again, you may have an intrinsic motivation to take a car apart, put it back together again. If you have a natural ability or a natural intelligence in music, I've known students that learned how to play guitar or piano at age 5. Basically, just sat down and taught themselves how to do that. They would be considered a prodigy if they did that with a math book. But because it was music, sometimes it's not considered as important. But that's an intrinsic motivation that child has to pick up that guitar or sit down at that piano, versus extrinsic motivation. If your mother forces you to sit down at piano every day and says you have to do this or I'm going to punish you, and if you do it, I'll give you a dollar at the end of your lesson, that extrinsic motivation will probably destroy any intrinsic motivation that the child has. That's what the evidence says anyway. So again, extrinsic motivation is reward or punishment. And our society is based on extrinsic motivation. Do this and we'll reward you. We'll give you money. Do something bad and you won't get your reward. You'll get punished. You'll get fired. Or if you do something really bad, you go to jail. So our whole culture is based on extrinsic motivation for the most part. But the education system is definitely based on this idea. And it's, in education, it's A's or F's, rewards or punishments. So some more progressive forms of education, we'll talk about those. They really work with the child's intrinsic motivation as much as possible. Ken Robinson wrote a book called The Element. He wrote several books. I recommend any of them, but this particular one was pretty interesting. So when a person is in a place in their life where they're able to combine their personal passion with their natural ability. So whatever their natural ability is, whatever area that was, and then something that they're just extremely passionate about. And he goes through case studies of maybe a dozen different people here, and every one of these people are in their element, something that they're excelling at in their field. almost every one of these people did very poorly in the education system. They did, some of them just did okay, but they all had like one mentor that they found somewhere along the way, whether it was a doctor or a coach or a teacher that encouraged them to really follow their passion and their natural ability. So he gives a bunch of really great examples. Paul McCartney, from the Beatles, Paul McCartney helped finance one of the schools that Ken Robinson opened, and Paul McCartney told a story about when he graduated high school, and by the time he graduated high school, not one of his teachers recognized that he had any musical ability whatsoever. And then he went on, a year later, he's one of the most popular singer-songwriters in the world, and I think he's the most successful songwriter in history. And none of his teachers had ever recognized that he had any musical ability whatsoever. So, what is within you that was unrecognized in the high school and elementary school system? Because a lot of people get through. I was probably 30 or 35 before I kind of heard that the education system is not perfect. I would just assume that there was something wrong. Like most people, I assume because I was not excelling in the education system that there was something wrong with me. So again, motivation, education, standardized testing. There's a lot of critics of standardized testing, and I know it's a big debate. I'm going to, for the most part, present the side of the debate that is against standardized testing. Alfie Kohn is a big proponent of progressive education, and he talks a lot about standardized tests. I should mention he excelled in school. When he was in high school, he was offered some kind of an award because he did so well, and he turned it down just because of what he saw as a great deal of hypocrisy in the traditional education system. And he points out, makes a very good point. Standardized tests offer a remarkably precise method for gauging the size of the houses near the schools. So this was a comment on the fact that the single leading predictor of success on standardized tests is socioeconomic status. That's across the board. So that doesn't mean that, if you go in every school, the smartest kids are always going to be the wealthiest. But if you go, it's almost guaranteed. If you're looking at the average scores of the schools across the country, the average score is going to reflect almost exactly the average income in that area. And the way that we work it is the schools that do worse in the standardized tests get less money. So I know that they're trying to make some changes to the program, so hopefully they'll work out. But the education system is based essentially on using extrinsic motivation. Telling students what they need to learn, and then rewarding them with A's or F's based on their ability to sit down and regurgitate the information that the teacher is giving. And it doesn't really emphasize the multiple intelligence theory. Again, the official system doesn't. There are a lot of teachers and people like that do recognize that theory. So, but how is your intrinsic motivation affected if you're in that system? And that's something for you to think about. Now that we're in college or you're in college, it's a little bit different. College is different because you have more of a choice in what you want to study. So hopefully you've gotten to this point at least and you're doing okay and you found something that you really enjoy. So how does this affect your focus on materialism and happiness? If you go through the education system and almost everything in your life is based on extrinsic motivation, and to succeed you need to do what we tell you to do, and if you do, we will reward you. You're kind of taught to go after that reward and ignore oftentimes your internal drives. So and following your internal drive is really what's going to make you happy. So going back to that video that we watched on intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, although they didn't really use that term. He's got some pretty interesting viewpoints on money and money as a motivator. These are some of the schools that are doing progressive education. Again, of course, Montessori's been doing this for a very long time. Waldorf schools, there's a couple of those in the area. The Philadelphia school, I don't know how to pronounce this next one, Mequon school maybe. So they all use progressive education. They all recognize the importance of multiple intelligence theory. That the students, I have here the students choose which subjects they like to study. That's not exactly true. But the students have input into what kind of projects they would like to work on, and then the faculty kind of help them or act as kind of a guide to help them. So they have all kinds of really interesting approaches. One of the issues is that these schools all average around $20,000 a year. I think Montessori is a little bit cheaper at $10,000 a year. So it's a lot of money, and not everybody can afford that much money. So there's also this idea of homeschooling, or sometimes they call it unschooling. And this is becoming more and more popular. It's probably the fastest growing segment of education right now. And that being said, there's not a lot of people doing it, but it certainly is out there. And it's, homeschooling historically was done for religious reasons. People wanted to protect their kids from, whatever the dangers of the outside world. A couple decades ago, that really started to change, especially when No Child Left Behind went into place. And it was just, most of the people doing this now, at least in this area, are middle to upper income. They have the time, they have the flexibility to spend time with their kids. And the kids don't learn at home anymore. They learn in small groups. Parents kind of get together and coordinate with each other and get a tutor or hire a private teacher to come in and teach 4 or 5 kids, a couple times a week. And, and they study all the normal subjects that are studied in school. It's just that they have a lot more free time to do additional projects. And again, the students kind of have a lot of input as far as what they choose to study and what they want to study. And, of course, you're allowed to get involved in school activities. The local public schools, you're allowed to play sports with those, with the public schools. It's so you can maintain a lot of social networks. So, of course, the biggest concern with homeschooling was always the social networks. These are a couple schools, the one's called the Open Connections. It's like Media, Newtown Square area, and then there's another one in Germantown. And they're learning resources for homeschooled kids. So generally the kids go there for maybe once or twice or 3 times a week, and they go and they have kind of open sessions with other kids, and they work on projects together, and it's pretty cool stuff. We went to visit, and the kids were building a boat, and they were using math skills, and they were all using tools, and they just use real world activities to learn how to do math, for example, things like that. So it's kind of cool approach to education. Um, so kind of moving on to parenting a little bit, most of the literature out there on parenting suggests using some form of extrinsic motivation, reward and punishment, and corporal punishment, physical discipline, hitting a child. No, as far as I know, no books are recommending that. If anybody ever did, I would be surprised, at least from a professional standpoint. All the research that's ever been done on the subject suggests that physical discipline will elevate the risk for aggressive behavior, depression, anxiety, some other issues. So depends how it's done, obviously. The more excessive, the more often, probably the more likely that some issues could develop. I know that this is a kind of a cultural thing, so I don't want to offend anybody. But for the most part, the psychologists are saying that you should never hit a child. And then even milder forms of discipline, there are still some concerns, especially milder forms of extrinsic parenting. And the one that comes to mind first and foremost is the timeout. So the timeout was adopted, I don't know, maybe a decade ago or 15 years ago or 20 years ago, kind of as an alternative to hitting a child. So it's another form of discipline as an alternative to actually using physical discipline. And this came from the original study that this came from was control of behavior in chimpanzees and pigeons by timeout from positive reinforcement. So this was in 1958. This was someone who was a colleague of B.F. Skinner, who was real big into behaviorism, controlling behavior, modifying behavior with reward and punishment. And that's the first time, as far as I know, this is the first time that timeout was used in a scientific term. And so they would remove the positive reinforcement. Usually it was food when you're using laboratory animals. In the case of children, you use timeout from the positive reinforcement. The positive reinforcement in children is not food, it's love. It's a temporary removal of love to modify a child's behavior. And children are not laboratory animals. The term timeout sounds kind of innocuous, like let's take a timeout and take a break and try and figure this out. But this is really where it comes from. So the problem is that in the child's mind, and the child's undeveloped mind or developing mind, they don't understand that the parent still loves them. They see that the parent's love is conditional upon the child's behavior, their own behavior. So, yeah, and of course the parent is going to say, I love my child. This is why I'm doing it, because I want them to learn. I want them to learn how to behave appropriately. And but in the child's mind, their self-worth is based on their behavior. So they start to essentially judge themselves as they get older. They judge themselves based off of their behavior, and they tend to feel more guilt after doing something, bad or inappropriate, eating too much ice cream or drinking too much beer. Those are probably the two things that I do too much. But I just don't feel guilty about doing it afterwards. So this is part of the problem. And I know that, again, this is very common. These techniques are very common. Whether you're talking about timeout or verbal discipline, or corporal punishment. And again, corporal punishment, again, research has been very consistent on this. Physical discipline elevates the risk for aggressive behavior. Children learn from their parents. So if they're doing something wrong and the parent comes and yells at them, when they're with their peers and something goes wrong, they're going to do what they learn. They're going to yell at the child, or they're going to hit the child if they're used to being hit. So we need to be careful. And I know that these techniques are pretty common, and but we also have to consider that depression, anxiety are epidemic in our culture, and there are reasons for it. Part of why I put this right after the stress management section is because there are so many issues that develop from stressors related to school, and it may be as equally important or more important in some of the parenting techniques that are being used. So Alfie Kohn is kind of interesting. It's not just the discipline part of this, it's the excessive praise. So it's the whole reward and punishment that he doesn't like. Some people will say, you should never hit a child, you should just praise them over and over and over again. And he doesn't like that either. He's got a wonderful book. It's called Unconditional Parenting. I have a couple books that I have, I'll show you in a minute. But he said that excessive praise creates what he calls praise junkies, and they will only do the behavior when they get the praise. So as soon as the praise is removed, they won't do the behavior that you really want them to do, that you're trying to reinforce. So it kind of backfires on you. And he uses the term sugar-coated control. So you're still trying to control the behavior. So he's got some really interesting techniques, and he's got some really cool books out there. He's very much against the idea of using grades as a motivator for children. He's, again, a PhD in psychology. He's got a lot of theories about education and parenting as well. He says he's very critical of the traditional education system. He calls it the feel-bad education system. Again, because you're not motivating kids to follow what they are intrinsically motivated to do. You're extrinsically motivating them to do something that a lot of times they're not really interested in doing anyway. So he's very much against homework. He says that homework in children under 8th grade is irrelevant. There's no evidence to ever support giving any children homework at all. He calls it second shift. It causes more problems than anything. Once they get into 8th grade or high school, a little bit is okay, but kids today get way too much homework. So check out his books. Again, I would recommend the book Unconditional Parenting. It's got a whole bunch of approaches to raising children beyond discipline. And they're pretty effective techniques for the most part. I use them with my son. And look, I know that it's hard. I have a 5.5-year-old. Like any parent, I raise my voice from time to time. We don't use physical discipline with them. It's hard not to sometimes get aggravated, but we try as much as we can to use unconditional parenting, some of these unconditional parenting techniques, and they actually do seem to be pretty effective. As far as education, we're not exactly sure what we're going to do with them yet. Some sort of progressive education. Depends, I guess, what our financial situation is going to look like. All right, I hope this was helpful. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you look more into, progressive education. Thank you very much. Have a great day.